rupture, discontinuity, gap, break, abyss, disappearance, cesura, suspension, boundary, limit, accident, chaos, censorship, ecstasy. I think this is the death of Socrates, isn't it?
Sophocles, yeah. Socrates, right, Socrates.
In Plato's book, The Republic, the figures of Adeimantus and Glaucon interrupt in the various exchanges, causing the dialogue to digress. The effect of this is to change the direction of the discourse, but in ways that are subtle and are thus relatively attended in terms of later critique. Interruption was known as a rhetorical device in ancient Greek literature, but Plato also develops it into a key component of philosophical method, suggesting by implication the idea that philosophy interrupts us. Interruption can also be understood as a forerunner to exposing the device, making strange or the alienation effect within the 20th century art and literature. Is this Oedipus?
Yes.
In his notes on the Oedipus, Holderlin discussed the idea of a counter-rhythmic interruption, confronts the tendency of succession through the employment of proposing or cesura. Is that correct?
Zaria.
Sarua.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. In the case of the play Oedipus, he attributes the manifestation of the cesura to the speeches of Tiresias, who is blind, but who sees everything, which contrasts with Oedipus, who sees but is blind to the truth. The pure word, or caesura, is a place where insight occurs, and therefore is not indirect speech or within representation. In the drama itself, when Oedipus sees the whole picture, he blinds himself, but this act is not seen by the spectators, but is instead indicated by a wailing sound, because it is in excess of what can be witnessed.
Is it Holderlin?
Holderlin interrupts, complicates, and even at times suspends articulated language. He discovers a speech that maintains silence. Alice Kosnia. Poetry in aspiring towards the condition of the pure word or caesura, and as such interrupts, forcing language to give way. In emptying or hollowing out language, a new reality is opened. After writing his first two critiques, Kant realized that there was a gap between nature or necessity and human freedom. So he wrote his third critique on the judgment of taste. This critique opened out the difference between cognitive reason and aesthetic judgment, and conceived beauty as an arrest of the faculty of understanding. Flowers appear to signify their own attraction, and that attraction is organized through the manifest form of beauty itself. We do not require concept to understand this, and this being so, is at the root of our pleasure within this encounter. Flowers almost appear, as if by design, to be a means of arresting vision. They might even make us feel that vision itself is a fragrance. They reproduce themselves through this power of attraction or solicitation. we might instinctively acknowledge that the flower as a code of visual pleasure is connected to the moment of arrest, and as such, a vehicle that potentially takes us out of ourselves. Do we, in this moment, contemplate upon the fading and decay of the bloom, morality, the end of history? In further contemplation, all these things are possible, but not within the immediate glance of the eye, because this glance is impaired by the desire of arrest.
Wow. Wow.
She thought that she was looking at some fragment of archaic ruins, but then realized that it was just the impact of wind upon rock. This switch in perception took place within a blink of the eye. Observe the light and consider its beauty. Blink your eye and look at it. That which you see was not there at first, and that which was there is there no more. Leonardo da Vinci. She said that in living in the mountains had made her start thinking like mountains. Such a way of thinking was non-human or pre-human, but it introduced another dimension of time into her way of living. Vertical red on gray-white border, Yan Wen Xiong. This border is located outside the Bapa village in Huandongnan, Buzhou. It has a long history. According to legend, in the Ming Dynasty, Wu Wang, the king of Dong, passed the place. He met a pregnant woman and asked, "Can you see the cattle I'm driving?" The pregnant woman said, inexplicably, "I don't see any cattle. I saw boulder moving." At this moment, the boulder stopped moving suddenly. Wu Mian whipped the boulder, which instantly turned into 3 sections, one of which flew to Xishan, the second to Bapa, but the third one remained in Guangdong. The pregnant woman was so scared that her hair bun became crooked. So this is also the origin of the Dong woman's buns, always been crooked to one side. This boulder is now locally enshrined as a sacred mountain. Every New Year, villagers pray under the mountain for good weather and good grain. The vertical red was on the mountain for 3 days. It accompanied these villagers day and night. At the 4th dawn, it disappeared, and now there is another bedside story about the red waterfall in the village.
This is a painting by the Ming painter Bada, who's both a monk and a painter. And they didn't know whether he was mad or whether he was feigning that he was mad. Does someone else read now?
Should I try?
Yeah.
Okay. The Chinese artist Bada San in Ming Dynasty discussed his identity and took up the refuge in the Buddhist temple after the Manchu conquest of the 1644. This gesture was returned in Ming or leftover subjects of the fallen dynasty. When he painted fish, he introduced the look of the human eyes, which animated the relationship between the different living entities.
It was the philosopher Gaston Bachelard.
Bachelor.
Bachelard.
Oh.
He wrote The Politics of Space.
The idea of epistemology break or hold on.
Rupture.
Yes. Or rupture. There's a call coming. Sorry. The idea of an epistemology break or rupture was introduced by Gaston Bachelard in order to explain how obstacles within the scientific understanding are overcome. This idea was developed in turn by Louis Althusser to explain the development of Marxist thinking in order to articulate the difference between the two opposing the purchase to the exposition of the knowledge. I am the dreamer of the words, of the written words. I think I am reading. A word stops me. I lift the page. The syllables of the word begin to move around. Stressed accents begin to invert. The word abundance, it means like an overload, which is too heavy and prevents the dreaming. The words take on another meanings as if they had the right to be young, and the words wander away, looking in the knocks and crannies of the vocabulary for the new company, bad company. The Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Reverie, 1960. The idea of a paradigm shift was introduced by Thomas Kuhn in order to explain the deeper structural change within the beliefs about the way things are. Such changes might sudden as opposite to slow incremental shifts. This implicates the notion that although the information might be the same way of the interpreting it is subject to the different perception of it. Skip James was the Delta blues singer who first recorded in 1931, but with little success, he drifted into the obscurity and resurfaced in 1960 when he performed at the Newport Folk Festival. It had been pursued that he had already died. The girl with the pale, I guess. It is something forgotten how Vermeer. It is sometimes forgotten how Vermeer disappeared from the historical visibilities until he was recognized as the precursor to Impressionists in the second half of the 19th century. This eliminates how artists are not already formed within their working life, but how such information can be the product of a later shift within the historical events.
Walter Benjamin.
The Walter Benjamin was barely published within his lifetime, but from the period of the early 1970s, he became one of the most published and comment upon the philosopher and writers of the 20th century. One of his central figure of the sort was the dialectic image, which is in a part of the defined as the dialectics at the standstill or as an interruption within the continuum. The present is defined by Benjamin in the interwar years as the site of the tremendous shattering of the tradition. The crisis in the communication of the experience, in memory, the hence, in the possibility of the historical experience. Relations between the generations are no longer media of the historical continuity about crisis, a rupture, and misunderstanding. It is the world gone out of joint. Benjamin saw in Kafka's work impossibility of communicating the experience of a modality in the language of the tradition. Once he was certain of the eventual failure, everything worked out for him in route as in a dream. Kafka made the death mask for the tradition.
What does it mean? Death mask.
Bertolt Brecht, the playwright and poet, who was friends with Walter Benjamin.
Brush employment of interruption pervade his staging of the unfolding drama by neutralizing the freezing and the framing device or a change in direction. In this way, he cut the drama into the pieces and thereby introduced the principles of the montage or fragment. The fragment served to link the occupation of the both Brecht and Benjamin in the opposition to the totalizing aesthetic formulation of the social realism. Discontinuity incomplete. The fragment expands the contrast around itself, failing both to touch upon itself or to touch further still at a boundary or limit. Yet in this, it's a point towards that thing in which touching the surfaces, that thing. It's a gesture residing in the ability to point towards that which cannot be complete in either task, communication. The gesture, invisibility, invariably accompanying interruption.
Okay, we have a new reader next. Who's new reader?
I can read.
Good.
I don't know if I'm unhappy because I'm not free, or if I'm not free because I'm unhappy.
This is still from a Godard film, Breathless.
In Jean-Luc Godard's film Breathless, he introduced the idea of the jump cut and ways of talking both in character, but to the camera as well, as if to draw attention to improvisation within the script. In this way, the film narrative was punctuated on the level of its continuity, as the audience were drawn into considering the devices of cinema. Godard develops such devices as characters addressing audiences directly or text being introduced to break continuity. I think you've shown us clips of somebody in a cafe with the coffee and the smoke and the thoughts coming between people.
That's
with
two or
very
three,
little.
two or three things I know about her from 1967, I think it is.
It was an adventure movie, Pierre Le Fou, 1965. Are you in a film or in reality?
It's Weekend. Again, a 60s film, which anticipates May 68.
Mimo Rotella, Tiki, 1961. His work is based on the principle of décollage, which employed the method of tearing away at existing street posters. Mimo Rotella, I Do Visi, 1962.
This is Emmanuel Levinas, the philosopher, and friends with Blanchot.
Levinas argues that ethics is the first philosophy, and at its center is the interruption between communication and ethics. In this, communication is troubled by having to face alterity, thus bringing the relation to the verge of new discursive possibilities. Interruption is therefore the beginning of a process of exposure.
소리야. 소리인지 모르겠어.
Maurice Blanchot.
Philosophy which puts everything into question is tripped up by poetry, which is the question which eludes it. Maurice Blanchot.
Is Susan Sontag.
The function of writing is to explode one subject, transform it into something else. Susan Sontag.
It's Kathy Acker, a New York writer.
Kathy Acker started to employ plagiarism in her writing as a device of employing multiple identities within her text. I came to plagiarism from exploring identity, and I wanted to see what pure plagiarism would look like. It was the simple fact of copying that fascinated me. I wasn't interested in the I or of me, but in the textual I looked like. So I took some biography and made it into an autobiography to see what would happen. I knew I wanted to plagiarize, but I didn't have a clear theoretical justification for what I was doing or why. So I just started filming these different texts and putting them together. Marceau Duchamp, 3 Standard Stoppages, 1914. 3 white threads were dropped randomly and then fixed in the position they fell. The employment of chance thus determined the final presentation of the work, which was described as stoppages. Duchamp thought that this work served as a gesture to liberate him from the past. Robert Morris, Box with its Sound of Its Own Making, 1961.
That just had a tape recording of him making the box. So it was an object in space, but also an object in time, or a process in time.
Sorry, may I just interrupt a bit? Because why is always the sound of these boxes? I couldn't really get it.
He made a sound recording of making the box. So he recorded the sound of the box of its own making.
So the physical box even didn't exist.
The physical box exists, but the sound of it being made is also included in the object.
Okay, so it's showing the process.
So it's
bit.
you've got this visual identity of the box, but you've also got the process of recording the making of the box through sound. So you've got sound and vision combined together into one. So it's both an object in time, which represents temporality, an object which is a production, an object.
How was that received at the time? Was it a complete novelty, or did people react to it in different ways?
I mean, it was seen as a kind of incredible breakthrough by a lot of artists, but also it was rejected by some who felt that it broke with sculptural integrity. So it was very controversial, and the matter of factness of it really disturbed a lot of people. Just an industrial-like box, a standard box with a tape recording. Was it performance or was it sculpture? Was it theatre?
What is made from this box? It's a
standard
metal.
No, wood.
Wood. Okay. Does it contain the sound of the sanding?
It records the sound of its making. So originally hammers and saws and bang.
So it's a picture of the original work.
Is this original?
The box.
Original box.
I don't know if this is I don't know, a gimmick, but when I sort of think of this, I like to imagine that there's also the sound of the box being burned and destroyed. I know that's not the case, but I kind of like the idea that you're not only experiencing its kind of creation, past and present, but you're also kind of aware that you're in a past, and the box is kind of going on into the future where it's going to be destroyed. It's just my sort of imagination about this box.
I think this work is quite powerful in patronizing people to accept this.
As a matter of fact, it's plain.
It's like, as Alex said, it's a bit like a gimmick. Make me think about another work. Who's made like art and shit in the can?
To be clear, I was saying, but my idea could be a gimmick, kind of added on. I don't think this is a gimmick myself. I quite like it, but my kind of imaginative extension could be gimmicky. But maybe you think this is a gimmick.
At some point.
It destroys the whole idea of decorative. The decorative. It's got no attempt to make something pleasurable. It's got no interest in visual pleasure. It's just a generic plain box.
But in text we've read earlier, there was this term which was said, a visual pleasure gives a moment of a rest. I'm not sure whether I would call that a visual pleasure, because it's so out of the ordinary existence of what we would see everywhere, which makes me question how it got termed as a piece of art. I suppose with the inclusion of the recording, it adds a different dimension. But I quite like Alex's idea that then we should see it sort of burn into ashes, and then you'd get a whole performance.
I think that would make it too theatrical.
Too theatrical.
You wanted to make it very matter of fact and industrial and kind of create the sense of why wasn't it done before even. So just took a paradigmatic shift in thinking. Instead of an object in space, I want an object in time.
Make me think about incarnation from nothing become the box and then going to be the ash.
I think that
I
was
think John.
too poetic for Morris.
Also, I'd like to add on to what Jonathan just said about the object being in the space, but then now we are including the time of its making, process and result all together. Also, I'd like to add on to the time that it was made 1961. So that was like 60 years ago. So these days we see a lot of artwork that is really going in between boundaries. Is it sculpture, performance, visual art? A lot of things are now very in ambiguity. You can't really define one thing. But think about this happened 60 years ago. I think it's quite true. Something like whenever I watch the Space Odyssey, just like keep reminding myself it was made in 1958. That sort of things. These people have this thinking on the bench and they make things happening.
I mean, it's sort of like a little revolution. Which a lot of artists at that stage were trying to find the least condition by which something can be art. Very raw, very...
This question started from Marcel Duchamp, right? When he put this fountain into the expression space. From that piece, I start to asking the question, what is art is?
Yeah, so it's speculative.
It's against the formality.
It's against aesthetic formalism of Greenberg.
Mm.
Yeah.
What was so arresting about the Robert Morris presentation was its dislocation as to what its status was. Was it sculpture, conceptual art, or a conjunction of process and presentation?
There are a number of questions which aren't necessarily answered. This is a Dutch artist, John Bavasada.
Jean Bavasada created a whole number of events in which he staged falls. In this work, Fall to Amsterdam, 1971, he falls into the canal. It is an act which suspends reason. Gravity simply takes over. I do not make body sculptures, body art, or body works. When I fell off the roof of my house or into a canal, it was because gravity made itself master over me. Joseph Beuys, Capri Battery, 1985. When Joseph Beuys produced this multiple, he interrupted two different systems, one industrial and one natural, in order to suggest a unity of the two outside of their common identity.
Doris Salcedo.
The work of Doris Salcedo, Tabla Rasa 6, 2018 to 2020, is composed out of a commonplace object of use that becomes transformed into a different form of an object, namely an object for mourning that disappeared. In this way, it becomes a memory sculpture. The way that an artwork brings materials together is incredibly powerful. Sculpture is its materiality. I work with materials that are already charged with significance, with meaning they have required in the practice of everyday life. Then I work to the point where it becomes something else, where metamorphosis is reached.
The Japanese photography, Iraqi.
Georges Bataille described orgasm as the little death. As such, it is a sensation of discontinuity or joyance. Roland Barthes related this to the experience of reading great literature. In the two photographs by Araki, one references the sexual climax explicitly, whereas the second image can stand as a release or joyeuse in the form of a splash of color. In this, there is no measuring with time. A year doesn't matter, and 10 years are nothing. Being an artist means not numbering and counting, but ripening like a tree. Rainer Maria Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet. The Greek word kairos means the right or the proper time for action. The release of the archer's arrow at the right moment, or the delivery of a timely speech, act within a play, are examples. Kairos is understood more abstractly as the potential for overcoming dualism by weaving together such things as conflict and resolution. In this painting, Judas beheading Holofernes, Caravaggio presents the passage of the divide between life and death. The work captures the sense of a suspended interval in ways that anticipate the advent of cinema.
It's still from Psycho.
In the so-called shower scene, Hitchcock evaded the rigid code of censorship through heightening of sound effects that created a psychological sensation of extreme terror. In turn, it became one of the most watched and studied fragments in the history of cinema.
Wow.
The films of Sergio Leone introduced a new way of depiction within the Western. The gunfights are extended in time by offering close-ups of faces in order to build the intensity of the various scenes. The effect is almost operatic, but this is undercut by a lack of continuous dialogues. Interruption and its attendance figures is a major aesthetic device for introduction of discontinuity into fabric of the artwork, whether as a form of arrest, a staging of shock, or as an advent of a new configuration of direction. It introduces complexity into how the artwork is spaced and how it might discover relation.
These are the various books which might be referred to.
The structure of a scientific revolution. Kairos. To show me the aesthetic of chance. Artist experiment. Hannah Hooch life portrait. George Patia, eroticism. George Patia. Don Quixote, forbidden fictions.
To censor is to withdraw or to interrupt public exposure. Censorship takes on many forms, but its rhetoric is to protect boundaries from transgressive forces.
The accident of art. Interrupting Auschwitz. Art, religion, philosophy. Art, religion, philosophy. Interrupted dialectic.
Hello. So I was driving, but on the Robert Morris piece, I have a book by Robert Morris about Robert Morris's small sculptures, of which this is one. He made maybe 500 over a period of about 8 years. A lot of them are heavily influenced by Duchamp and John Cage. And this particular sculpture in the book, it describes how he asked Cage to come to his studio to show him the work when it was finished, and Cage sat there for 3 hours, didn't say a word, and then left. And I think Morris describes how it was difficult to... It was a strange existence because he was surrounded by such, for him, great artists as Duchamp and Cage. So I think he's heavily influenced in these small works by these two artists. And he also made a number of pieces which are very influenced by the three stoppages and are very similar in nature. And he made a lot of boxes. I mean, there's a very famous box called I, which has the big letter I on the front of it, and inside the box, which I think is made from lead and locked shut, is a naked picture of himself.
It's a model, isn't it, of himself?
Yep.
Three-dimensional.
That's really interesting, Patrick. I was kind of wondering, it's almost as if, when you think, is it 3 minutes 44 or 4 minutes 33? I can't remember. Anyway, Cage's famous piano piece. It's almost as if he's turning to creating a new sort of dimension of it's now a 3-hour piece of him with the box or something. And I don't know. The fact that he spent 3 hours with it, do you think Morris was intimidated or kind of pleased or disappointed? Does he talk about his feelings about that?
Well, the curators of the book who worked with him just got that out of the interview. They didn't, as I recall, they didn't say much more about it's just that comment was made, 30 years or so after the actual event, when he was interviewed by the two curators who were creating his raison d'etre. I don't think there's much more, as I recall. But there is throughout the book, a reference to Cage and Duchamp and how they were. It's almost like they were overpowering him or overshadowing him, as if he felt it's impossible to make anything meaningful when you're surrounded by these two. So I'm sure he was hoping that Cage would approve. But I don't think he got a response. But maybe that was a positive response from Cage.
I was just going to add, we converse and communicate, but sometimes silence itself can be also the form of communication. So for someone like Cage to look at the box for 3 hours, it just means something else. Maybe he's in appreciation, and he's just observing it. Or by sitting there for 3 hours, there certainly is a message to be delivered by that act itself, I think.
How would you feel, Alex, if Cage had sat there for that long and then just walked out?
If I was sitting there as well, I think I'd start getting a bit anxious probably about 45 minutes in. By 3 hours, I think I'd
Back up.
I think it's kind of amazing to capture someone's imagination for that period of time.
I mean, you've got to remember also they were making things with hardly any audience. It wasn't like these things sold or had a market. I mean, on the whole, no one was interested. Only other artists were vaguely interested and very competitive. So a lot of artists at that time felt very isolated or very exposed or very vulnerable.
It's a bit like the project that Structural Film was doing, wasn't it? I mean, it just strikes me as very similar to what was going on in film practice at the time, where they're trying to film the material of film and show that in the film and restrict themselves to that. So the box for me is like a film, except in solid form. And I could completely understand Cage sitting there and watching it for 3 hours. Seems like a normal thing to do, but I could also see that it wouldn't be completely normal and a bit intimidating if it was your work.
I mean, it's very zen to just get up and walk out without saying anything.
But that's very 60s too, isn't it? To not actually express criticism in words, or like to, yeah, because they're also problematizing criticism and communication in terms of art.